it's very clear to you and to every single very advanced student and specialist that the standard narrative has holes in it. That's what I'm going to say. The standard narrative does not answer some very pressing questions.
But for the sake of the truth, to piece together and find out what really happened. Then we have Yasir Qadhi, who found himself in this dilemma, spent his whole life diving into Islam, memorizing the Quran and learning it, only to find out that there are huge holes in the story. Now what does he do? Then we have Farid, who, being the self-righteous defender of the Ummah, decided that Yasir Qadhi was dangerous and needed to be exposed for thinking the Quran wasn't preserved. Then we have Dawah Man, another self-righteous idiot, who amplified Farid and publicly condemned Yasir Qadhi. Instead of privately dealing with these issues, these Muslims caused it to spread more and more. Yasir Qadhi couldn't do a thing. This was all out of his control.
This right here is the transcript to the emails, people, that you can see that are on Ismail Patel's Facebook page, where he's showing the emails between him. He's finally only revealed them this week, where he's speaking back and forth to Ganguteli, and he's kind of apologizing, but at the same time saying, I was in touch with a really big, this is another one where he's saying, I was in touch with this academic, one of UK's finest academics. So all this fitna, all this drama, come on, like, think about it. We're thinking, Yasir Qadhi has really dug such a deep hole that a portion of the Ummah has drowned. We hear reports people have apostatized, they've had doubts in Islam, they've done all of this. Who was behind this? I would never have thought it was our very own Khaja Ganguteli. Oh my God! Honestly, I am lost for words. I'm at a loss for words here. This whole fitna was created by this Wahhabi, this Wahhabi Khaja Ganguteli. What the hell was he trying to do? He was trying to save the Ummah by exposing emails to Dawah Man, because Dawah Man's friend is one of the best academics in the UK. It was like, whoa, oh my God. I was like, well, I had to share that with you guys. Farid leaks. And indeed, not only does, if only for this leak, they had created a nappy that could have prevented. Obviously, look at it. This leak from Ganguteli was enough to drown Yasir Qadhi. And with Yasir Qadhi trying to somehow paddle through the situation, he managed to drown a bunch of other people with him as well, because of his magnificent explanation, which was so terrific. So this is like, wow. Oh man, this is just, I did not see this coming, so I had to share that with you guys.
Fast forward 4 years, these leaked emails are still causing controversy and doubt, to the point where Muhammad Hijab, who had some rapport with Dr. Qadhi, decided to bring these up in a safe dialogue on his platform. Lo and behold, this was his biggest mistake and ended up being his and Qadhi's undoing. He asked Dr. Yasir Qadhi about the preservation issue, saying that this was the most popular question that people had for him.
On this point, I just wanted to go to another thing, which is probably the most, when I put on the community page, the most asked thing, which is, there was a video that was released by one of our brothers, some time ago, Brother Imran, and he released this big video about the leaks of some kind of email chat that you were involved in about preservation of Quran. Okay,
Yasser tried to hold him off and told him not to push the issue.
what would you write?
You're pushing me, and I'm saying it's not hikmah to listen.
But Hijab kept ramming through it with questions, insisting they had to discuss it. After the interview, the backlash was severe. Hijab even threw Yasir Qadhi under the bus, saying, "We will refute him if he goes against the Quran." And he took down the last 30 minutes of their conversation. He didn't even bother doing a clean edit. He just cut out the whole ending of it. It just ends in the middle of a conversation. He didn't even put the intro back, anything like that. He just hastily removed it, all of it. But it wasn't enough. It was too little, too late. Muslims were having doubts. Many were leaving Islam. And then Yasir Qadhi went on the offensive. He wrote an angry post on Facebook saying the Quran was actually preserved. He filed a copyright claim that failed against David Wood's response video and maybe others. Then he ultimately took down the entire video from his channel now. Unfortunately for him, after already receiving over 100,000 views or more, this has gone viral like nothing else. I myself have received a comment on my blog yesterday from a Muslim who said, "Currently, I'm grappling with what Yasir Qadhi said about Quran preservation." There was even a portrait someone drew in London in chalk representing what Dr. Qadhi said. If anything ever went viral, it's this. All Farid, Hijab, and Qadhi do is speed up the decline of the Quran. It was already there in academia. It just wasn't known to the masses. And they did it all on their own, without any help from any ex-Muslims. The Muslims themselves made the problems with the Quran super obvious for everyone to see. And the bumbling damage control just made it worse.
Many Muslims just simply have this the simplistic idea that there has only been one version of the Quran throughout history, and that's the version that we're holding now. And when we read our history, we see, in fact, that there were variations, multiple readings. In academia, there was always a suspicion, you know what, we would really like to find a pre-Uthmanic Quran. We would like to see what was there before Uthman suppressed it all and gave us the one copy which everybody has been running around with now. Now, in Abu Bakr's time, it was recognized that the Prophet, peace be upon him, died without leaving the Quran in a collected volume. In 1972, a mosque was being repaired in Sana'a in Yemen, and it was found that in the ceiling of the mosque, there were many old documents stashed. And among the documents, some were Quranic copies. And there was one of particular interest that came to be widely referred to now as the Sana'a palimpsest. It's an erased manuscript. So somebody had a manuscript, they wrote on it, then erased it and wrote something else over it. The lower text shows some significant variations.
So I guess the question still stands, right? Like, how is it possible that there was this manuscript there, right, palimpsest, as you mentioned, when Uthman is purported to have sent out all of these manuscripts that were the official ones to different parts of the world?
Other companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, could have been compiling their own copies as well, or they could have written from their own memories, and that could be at variance with the Uthmanic Codex. If scholars were wondering, and they have wondered, like, what else is there? Like, did something else get suppressed that we would like to know about? Well, here, this comes, as a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the sense of complacency that many Muslims have gone around with, thinking that, okay, everything has been preserved, dot for dot, letter for letter, which actually is not a scholarly way of thinking about the Quran. Our scholars have always known and have always described in our classical books variations and manuscripts, like, it's read like this by Ubay bin Ka'b, it's read like this by Ibn Masud, and so on. And in the Codex of Ibn Masud, it was seen to be written like this. In the Codex of Ubay bin Ka'b, it was seen to be written like this with this or that variation. So these were always known in scholarly circles to have existed. But recently, average Muslims have just simply, without bothering to learn, they have just simply parroted a common way of speaking about the Quran and saying, it's 100% the way it's always been, and they cannot imagine any variations.
So can we feel confident then that the Quran that we have now is preserved accurately from God?
Yes, we could say, today, most Muslims read the Quran in a text that is referred to as the Egyptian edition of 1924. But this is not the only text of the Quran that is read throughout the world. In North Africa, there is a slightly different text that is based on a slightly different reading, mostly corresponding to what we read in the rest of the world, but with some slight variations that do not affect anything that Muslims believe and do not have any major impact on any Muslim practices. And then too, in some parts of Africa, there is another reading of the Quran and a matching manuscript that is prevalent. And here too, we find some slight variations that do not affect Muslim beliefs and do not affect Muslim practices in any significant degree.
Currently, there are 5 different versions of the Quran found in the Muslim Ummah. When I say there are 5 versions, it means that there are 5 different versions which have different words at times. There are verbs which are different. There are nouns which are different. There is a difference between plural and singular. There's a difference between declensions or the i'rab. And then we have other differences as well.
When I say different versions, of course, I refer to the fact that the words are different. Then there is this word order at times, which is different. Then we have, although these differences might not be very significant as far as their meaning is concerned, although there are some others as well which have a significant change of meaning as well, but still the claim that the Quran was preserved word for word in one format had that claim seemed to literally shake in its foundations.
When I say 5 versions, I am not talking about any pronunciation issue or qira'at issue. I am talking about versions, complete set of the Quran, which have different words, different from the Quran that we see in front of us today in the United States and some other parts of the world.
Human scribes over time have been human beings, and as human beings, naturally, they were prone to error, and they made many different kinds of errors. These kinds of errors are many.
Even the earliest versions of the Quran have these scribal errors. There are numerous examples in which we can see these scribal errors in which an extra va or extra ya or an extra alif is found in these versions of the Quran.
Extra alif, can you believe that? Extra alif. This is just crazy textual criticism. I'm not even going to address that. Extra alif and waw and fa, anyone knows spelling differences, scribal styles may differ, may vary. It's about the contents.
This is verse of Surah An-Naml has extra alif contained in it. The words are لَأُعَذِّبَنَّهُ عَذَابًا شَدِيدًا أَوْ لَأَذْبَحَنَّهُ. As you can see, the underlined word, the alif, which actually succeeds the other alif, is an extra alif because the word is لَأَذْبَحَنَّهُ. Or if we don't accept this to be a letter which is redundant, then we find this anomaly that this word would read in a very opposite way.
Extra alif and waw and fa. It's about the content.
We find this anomaly that this word would read in a very opposite way, and the words would be أَوْ لَا أَصْبَحَنَّهُ. It will be a negative particle instead of presenting the positive picture. Similarly, another example is from Surah Al-Imran. This is verse 158, and here again we find an extra alif. The words are وَلَئِن مُتُّمْ أَوْ قُتِلْتُمْ لَإِلَى اللَّهِ تُحْشَرُونَ. The first of these alif or the second of these alif is redundant, and it has to be subtracted from reading or deleted from reading. Otherwise, we'll have an opposite meaning. لَإِلَى اللَّهِ تُحْشَرُونَ would mean that it is for sure that people shall be gathered before the Almighty. But if we read it with the second alif as well, then the words would become La ilallah, and you should not be gathered before the Almighty. So you can see there is an exactly opposite meaning. Other than these examples, there are numerous examples in which we can see these scribal errors in which an extra va or extra ya or an extra alif is found in these versions of the Quran. And it is not just the Quran that we have today. Even the earliest versions of the Quran have these scribal errors.
Well, we know that in Hadith literature there are hadiths which tell us that the Quran that we have is incomplete. The Rajam verse is a very typical example. It is called Mansukh Tilawa Dunul Hukum, which means that it is there.
Yeah.
Just the recital has been abrogated. Then we have the suckling verse.
Aisha reports that it was in Quran told by Allah, through Jibreel, the suckling verse about Quran allowing women doing unlawful acts with unlawful men. This is called the suckling verse of the Quran. Thus Quran we have now is not the original preserved from Jibreel.
Which the mother of faithful Aisha said that the Prophet had just died, and they still read that verse in the Quran, and we know that it's no longer in the Quran.
What is your position in relation to preservation of Quran? Is, for example, Hafs an Asim, riwayat Hafs an Asim, do you see it as preserved, munazzal from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala?
Every single student of knowledge knows, who studies ulum al-Quran, that the most difficult topics are ahruf and qira'at. And the concept of ahruf and the reality of ahruf and the relationship of the Uthmanic Mus'haf with the ahruf and the preservation of the ahruf. Is it 1? Is it 3? Is it 7? And the relationship of the qira'at to the ahruf. This is a topic that when you're the beginning student of knowledge, you're like, what is all of this going on here? When you go a little bit more, you learn to simply memorize what your teachers say and regurgitate it out. And you don't fully comprehend. When you do a deep dive is when things get very, very awkward and difficult. And this isn't new. This is from the time of the Sahaba. This is not a joke, brothers and sisters. The issue of ahruf and qira'at caused confusion to somebody whom the Prophet ﷺ said, if you want to listen to the Quran directly, listen to Ubay. Ubay is not some even average Sahabi. He is the Qari of the Quran. He is the master. He is who he is. And he goes, فَدَخَلْ فِي نَفْسِي شَكْ. What is all of this stuff? Again, this is you were asking some very honest question. This is the first time I'm saying these things. Many people are aware who listen to my lectures that I've mentioned the crises that happened to me at Yale. Now, for the first time, I'm telling you here. What was the crisis? I mentioned it, referenced it, but I never explicitly said it. Why didn't I say it? Because it should not be said in public. This was not something I brought up in public. And I would never bring it up in public. And I don't think it is wise to bring it up in public. This was the issue. That the issue of ahruf and preservation and qira'at and relationships between them, these are very, very difficult issues. And the most advanced of our scholars, they're not quite fully certain how to solve all of the unanswered questions in there. I don't want to get into that issue.
Okay, fine.
Why do I not want to get to that issue? Here's the point. These issues should only be discussed amongst people who know what the qira'at are. What was the crisis? The crisis was very simple. And by the way, this is now a well-known open secret amongst many Muslim graduate students and academics around the world. And this is well known. Traditional understandings of ahruf and qira'at cannot answer some of these pressing questions that are now being poked by our people outside of, by our academics, not our, by their academics outside of the faith tradition. In a Muslim environment, we'll press a little bit and then we'll say, okay, khalas, sami'na wa ata'na. And that's great, alhamdulillah. When you go to academia, they don't have that red line. And they're going to just, you know, the famous story of the emperor with no clothes. They're going to just point out, no, that doesn't make any sense. Well, that's not true, and this and that. And they'll bring issues, which I'm not going to mention explicitly, that you know are true because they're in your own books. They're not inventing anything new. They'll bring you riwayat, and they'll bring you athar, and then you add to that very well-known issues of, I don't even want to be explicit. And it's very clear to you and to every single very advanced student and specialist that the standard narrative has holes in it. That's what I'm going to say. The standard narrative does not answer some very pressing questions. More and more professors and academics are writing stuff and they're bringing forth issues. Their level of now knowledge is leaps and bounds above what it used to be, 100 years ago, And by and large, our ulama in the Eastern world are not aware, by and large, of what's going on in the Western side of things. And they're not answering those questions in a manner that it needs to be answered. And this is something all of us that are in academia fully acknowledge. This issue of ahruf and qira'at has troubled the ummah from the very beginning of time. It's nothing new. And there are 15 opinions about this. None of them fully answer all of the questions that are raised. Some of them answer more than others. So the issues of the relationship, of the origins, of the ikhtilaf and all of this should only be discussed amongst those who are familiar with this science. I can't answer this question in a 20-minute interview, nor is it wise to do so, which is why I never brought this topic up myself. You will not find one lecture of mine about this issue. It should never be brought up in public. This is not something you discuss amongst the masses, ya akhi. It's not wise. You don't understand qira'at, let it be. And that's why even when they accused me, I didn't defend myself, because I would rather people have doubt about me than the Quran. What is happening in the last few years is not me anymore. It's the Western academics. These problems are now becoming mainstream.
If I were to give you a blank mushaf, yeah, and tell you to write what is munazzal verbatim from Allah into that mushaf with no human interference, would you write something which corresponds?
It's not an easy answer. It's not an easy yes or no. After we get off this phone call, me and you, let's have a number of discussions. No problem. It is kalamullah. It is munazzal.
What would you write?
You're pushing me. All of the qira'at are the Quran. All of the qira'at are authentic. Alhamdulillah. Leave it at that, ya akhi. Beyond this, honestly, I have no problem. We'll have discussions or take my class.
With this evidence-based scholarly released information, now Muhammad Hijab backs off of the belief position of total word-for-word preservation of Quran.
My understanding from the Islamic point of view is that perfect preservation means there is no change in any of the Arabic word for word, letter for letter.
Good.
Right?
Where's the source for that? Where's the source for that?
And frankly, you know, the Quran has been preserved, we believe, since the time of the Prophet till now. Word for word, letter for letter, haraka or vowel sign for vowel sign.
Perfect preservation means there is no change in any of the Arabic word for word, letter for letter.
Good.
Right?
Where's the source for that?
It is not even a remote possibility in most Muslims' minds that the Quran of today might be different from the Quran of Muhammad's day. But most Muslims have not read the Hadith for themselves. Once again, it was the most trustworthy Islamic traditions that subverted my faith. Volume 6 of Sahih Bukhari, a volume dedicated to the Quran, details the process of the Quran's collection in Book 61. We find that Muhammad used to dictate the Quran to Muslims orally, not having first written it down. It came to Muslims a few verses at a time, and sometimes Muhammad would relay the same verse differently to different Muslims. Because of this, people recited the Quran disparately enough, even in Muhammad's time, that there were heated, accusatory arguments among pious Muslims over what constituted the real Quran. Since Muhammad was still around, he dispelled the arguments by addressing the parties directly, saying, "Both of you are reciting it in a correct way, so carry on reciting." He admonished them not to argue over their differences, since the nations which were before you were destroyed because they differed. When Muhammad died, many people no longer felt the need to remain Muslim. Abu Bakr sent Muslims to fight the apostates, ordering them to fulfill their Islamic obligations. Muslim fought former Muslim until many who had known the Quran lost their lives in battle. Abu Bakr was worried that large parts of the Quran would be lost if the battles continued, so he officially ordered the Quran to be collected under the auspices of one Zayd ibn Thabit. Sahih Bukhari emphasizes that the Muslims easily forgot Quranic verses. On one occasion, only a single person was able to testify to some of the Quran's verses. After Zayd finished, the Quran was ultimately given to one of Muhammad's widows to safeguard. Even though the primary purpose for this collection was that verses not be lost, it was discovered that Zayd had accidentally left a small portion out of the Quran. Moreover, regions of the Muslim world were reciting the Quran incongruously enough that an appeal was made to the Muslim leaders to save this nation before it differs about the Quran. Breaking from the preference of Muhammad, who simply told his people not to focus on the differences, the Khalifa Uthman ordered that the Quran be standardized. They recalled the previous copy from Muhammad's widow, edited it, copied it, and distributed the copies to each Muslim province. Then, to settle the disputes over the Quran once and for all, Uthman ordered that all other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be destroyed by fire.
This was the story of the Quran's collection as found in Sahih Bukhari. Like the life of Muhammad, Sahih Bukhari depicted a raw, much more realistic story than what Muslims generally teach one another. What I had been taught was that Muhammad would dictate the Quran to scribes while Muslims memorized the revelations, and after Muhammad died, many Muslims had the Quran written and memorized. Zayd ibn Thabit was the first to officially write down the Quran, though this was not a difficult task because he had it memorized. His Quran was confirmed by other leading Muslims who also had the Quran memorized. That was it. According to widely accepted knowledge, there were no arguments over its contents, no poor memories, no fear of lost passages, no solitary witnesses, no forgotten verses, and certainly no orchestrated destruction of variants. The process of collecting the Quran recorded in Sahih Bukhari was so choppy that it left the door wide open for lost sections of the Quran. In fact, Sahih Bukhari testifies to this. When Zayd's standardized Quran was distributed, it left out some sections that a man named Ubay ibn Ka'b used to recite. Ubay insisted that, regardless of Zayd's Quran, he would not stop reciting those verses because he had heard them from Muhammad himself. I was shocked by the testimony of Sahih Bukhari. Why had my teachers not taught me the whole story? What else didn't I know? I turned to other books of hadith for their story. Sahih Muslim, the next most trustworthy source, records more problems. It documents that a whole surah is no longer found in the Quran, and at least one verse went missing around the time of Muhammad's death. Sunan ibn Majah, one of the next most authentic books, clarifies that the verse went missing because the paper on which it was written was eaten by a goat. As I continued my research, tradition after tradition kept cropping up that challenged the preservation of the Quran. Much like my incredulity when I studied the historical Muhammad, I simply would not assimilate these hadith into my mind, keeping them at bay by accepting the far-fetched explanations of Muslim apologists or by inventing some of my own. What finally pushed me over the edge, though, was when I revisited a hadith from Sahih Bukhari. According to the hadith, Muhammad named 4 men as the best teachers of the Quran. The first was Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, whom Muhammad distinguished as the foremost expert of the Quran. The last one was Ubay ibn Ka'b, whom Sahih Bukhari identifies as the best reciter of the Quran. These were the men that Muhammad hand-selected as the best teachers of the Quran. But as I studied the early sources, I found that they did not agree with the final Quran, which has been passed down as today's version. They didn't even agree with each other. In addition to the previously quoted hadith in which he refused to stop reciting certain verses, Ubay is known to have had 116 chapters in his Quran, 2 more than Zayd's edition. Ibn Mas'ud had only 111 chapters in his Quran, insisting that the additional chapters in Zayd's Quran and Ubay's Quran were just prayers, not Quranic recitation. Multiple early Muslims documented the differences between the many Qurans of the early Muslim world. Though it was thought that all of those documents were destroyed, one resurfaced in the early 20th century. It shows that, in many places, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b agreed with one another where Zayd ibn Thabit's Quran differed. I added up all the pieces in my mind. Multiple recitations of the same verse, missing verses, missing surahs, disputes over the canon, controlled destruction of all variants, How could we defend the Quran as perfectly preserved? I researched defenses online and read the most scholarly Islamic books I could find. As usual, attempts were made to dismiss as many of the sources as possible. Even still, after attempts at logical explanation were made, the Muslim scholars argued for a shocking position. Allah intended the lost sections to be lost. He intended the variants to be destroyed, and He intended Zayd's edition to be the final Quran. So in truth, the scholars were not arguing that the Quran had remained unchanged. They were arguing that Allah intended all the many changes that came to it. That was a defensive position at best, not one that could bear the weight of the entire Islamic case. I was forced to conclude that, once again, the early Islamic sources challenged what modern Islam taught me. The doctrine of the Quran's perfect preservation, far from defending the faith, needed to be defended by faith. With that final investigation, the keystone of my faith crumbled. The entire structure was ungrounded, poised to collapse at the slightest burden.